Hello, students, and welcome to this World History Screencast on Colonial Latin America. We're going to unpack what this term means, Colonial Latin America, and look at some of the broad themes that we'll then use to explore more of this history in our class in the coming weeks. Let's take a peek. So, the guiding question that we have here is about colonialism and the social structure in Latin America, which is one of the topics that a lot of students are investigating is part of their projects. But if you're investigating other topics, you can also pay attention. You'll see religion and politics and cities and all kinds of things. So the first thing to get our minds wrapped around is what are we looking at when we're looking at Latin America? And it's the countries that are today that are in green here in this map. Let's go ahead and take a sec. We're up. We're right here. So the Latin in Latin America refers to language. So these are areas where people speak Spanish or Portuguese or French as their primary language. And those languages are all related to Latin. So that's what the Latin means in Latin America or Latino or Latina. Sometimes the French speaking areas like Haiti are included in that, sometimes they're not. But most of these countries here that are green are Spanish speaking countries. The America part, Latin America, refers to where it is in the Western Hemisphere. So people from Spain are not Latino, even though Spanish is a Latin language, because they're not from the Western Hemisphere. Like other American histories, including the United States and Canada, the origin of Latin American culture is a mix of indigenous American culture, Native American culture, European, and African cultures. A different mix in different places, different and a lot of variety within those groups, but that's the basic idea. So that's what makes it Latin America. So what's colonial then? Well, colonial refers to when these areas were colonies. So you kind of see a few different whoa, looks like I got a misspelling up there. Got a rogue Z. But working past that, that should say colonial Latin America refers to when these areas were colonized by Spain and Portugal. We're going to focus on those two as it's the vast majority of the land and people in Latin America. So you can see in the map there, the colonization areas then refers to where people from those countries moved to. So the areas that are gray here are showing you where were the first areas where there was a lot of settlement of people from Spain or Portugal. And I would add, in addition to that, kind of throughout the Caribbean, especially this big island of Hispaniola here. You can also see that there was a religious motive for that. The crosses show areas where there were missionaries. And then you can see the economic motive. The Columbus, as you may remember, was initially looking to try to get to India, but soon Spanish colonists, people who came from Spain, settled in the New World, or came with New World to them, came to this part of the planet, were looking for riches. And at first they were just looking for gold. Like, Columbus demanded that indigenous people bring him gold. There wasn't quite as much gold in most of this area, but there was a lot of silver in a few different areas, as you can see. That and then cash crops like sugarcane became the primary economic production of Latin America. Move myself here. So that's what colonizing means, people coming from one area to another area and settling there and then taking advantage of the land. The political units that they form, like the governments then, are referred to as colonies. You can see Brazil was a colony of Portugal, and then the Spanish territories were divided into 4 or 5 colonies. This image here by Diego Rivera paints, literally, one view of this colonization. And it's from a series of murals that Rivera did to show Mexican history in the National Palace of Mexico in the early to middle part of the 20th century. And Rivera would have gone to school in a time when people would have been taught that the Spanish colonizers brought culture to the New World, and it would have had a very anti indigenous bias, the education that he received. And this mural is an attempt to correct that. And if anything, it goes too far, although I think there's some truth here. So we're going to take a look. I'm going to let you take a look at this picture here. Get myself completely out of the frame if I can. Well, I'll have to move myself around, huh? Let's go ahead and take a look here, and you'll see all the different ways that the Spanish are exploiting, taking advantage of what's happening in, this would be Mexico, as one part of Latin America. So this is showing the exploitative nature of colonialism. One way that the Spanish exploited these colonies was through forced labor, and the image you see there on the right is not accurate but representative image of silver mining in the Andes Mountains in South America. Potosi mine in what's today Bolivia, up in the Andes Mountains in South America, was one of the richest silver mines basically in world history, and had a huge economic effect on things around the world. But the Spanish settlers also used labor, forced labor, in order to grow crops and profit from crops that way. So it's mines and plantations are the targets for coerced or forced labor, forcing people to work. And there's a few different ways that that happened. The terms on this page would both, on this slide, would both be things that Spanish colonizers imposed labor obligations on indigenous people. Okay, what's that mean? That means there were ways that the colonial government allowed some wealthy Spaniards to make Indian people work for them. So this encomienda system was sort of the original system of that. And what happened then is Spanish king or queen granted land in the New World to Spaniards, which, by the way, is kind of theft, of course, because it wasn't theirs in the first place. But they would say that they were granting land on an island like Hispaniola to a Spanish, usually some sort of noble or minor noble. And then that person could force the people who lived on it, who already were there, to work. So not only was the Spanish crown saying, you can have this land, but you can make the people who are there work for you. In exchange for this, the Spanish landlord was supposed to provide Christian education and Christian resources, like build a church, pay for a church, and hire a priest so that people there could become Catholic. This didn't last for that long, but it did kind of set the model for how things were going to happen. So this is in the 1500s. In the Andes Mountains, there was a system called the Mita, which was based on the which was using, not based on, it's using the same word that the Inca Empire had used for forcing people to labor. So the difference was the Inca Empire, they were building public works, things like roads that could be used by everybody. Although I think you could say the Inca Empire was an empire and they were taking advantage of people they conquered too. So I'm not trying to let the Incas off the hook here, but it is, there's undeniable differences also. So forced to provide labor. That says I'll move myself out of the way here. I didn't make these slides with this purpose in mind. And this again would be something that happened in the Andes Mountains. So these are both examples of coerced labor that was directed at indigenous people. Okay. Take a look at this image here. See what's happening. Chattel slavery is another form of forced labor, and this is something that we've talked about already, how slavery in the New World the New World, the Europeans. And I say it that way because there was slavery in the Old World, according to Europeans, also, but the slavery in their New World, the Americas took a different form. So this word here is really worth getting down. So you should know, what makes that different. Is that enslaved people were treated as property. That's what that word chattel means. It's actually related to the English word cattle. So if you've heard this word chattel before and thought that sounds like cattle, well, that's not a coincidence. So as property, chattel slaves had no rights. So that meant that they couldn't necessarily become free, that their status was inherited. So meaning their children would be slaves. One thing that's worth noting, though, since chattel slavery is something that will be familiar to students who've studied American history, is that in the Spanish colonies, chattel slavery was not quite as harsh as it was in the English colonies. That doesn't mean it was okay or even like good, but it was not quite as harsh. There are more opportunities for enslaved people to become free in the Spanish colonies than there were in the English colonies. Sugar was the primary industry that was using enslaved people as laborers. And it's important to understand here that what we have is something of a coincidence, but it's a self-perpetuating coincidence. That's what I mean. So before this time in Europe, a lot of different kinds of people had been used as enslaved, had been forced to labor, usually in small numbers relative to the overall population. A few things make slavery in the New World, again, New World to Europeans, unique. One is that almost all of the enslaved people were from a different place and had been brought there. So that's the transatlantic slave trade, bringing people from Africa who were enslaved to the Americas. Now, the Spanish enslaved a lot of Indian people too. But by and large, Indian people were forced to labor in those other systems from the last slide. This combination of areas with very high populations of enslaved people who are being forced to labor to produce goods in large quantities like sugar, those people looking different and coming from a different area and being treated as a separate race for the first time in history, combined with this different legal setup, means that slavery in the Americas, as it existed in these colonial times, was just fundamentally different from any kind of other slavery in history. And part of that is the chattel nature of it. Part of it is the racial aspect of it, how it both caused and was an effect of racism. And then part of that is that you're looking at very large numbers of enslaved people as a percentage of the population. Like in places like Jamaica and the sugar producing areas of Brazil, enslaved people are like well over 90% of the population. So it's just like a whole different thing than had happened in the past. Right. It's mostly where this is happening. Oop, there's another kind of forced labor there, but we'll talk about that later. The word hacienda is a word in Spanish for large estate that might have enslaved workers on it, or it might have people on it being forced to labor through other means. Okay, I'm going to take a look at this. All right, so when you take a look at these here, now these are images that were drawn by a Dutch traveler and scientist who made a tour of Brazil in the middle of the 1600s. There's a brief time where part of Brazil was controlled by the Dutch, which Dutch would be people from the European country of the Netherlands. So Brazil would be the country where about 40% of enslaved people who were trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the Americas went to Brazil. 40%. About 5% came to what's today the United States. 5 to 10%. Right, closer to 10. But still, so it's like 4 times as many. That was mostly sugar mills. This idea of a mill is they're going to crush the sugar cane and then the juice is going to get boiled and then there'll be sugar. Okay. First, a lot of the labor was indigenous, then later African. When I say the labor, you want to kind of keep in mind that we're talking about like huge numbers of people involved in massive production, and the people who own these places are like, they're like CEOs of corporations. Okay, this is very lucrative. So why would the governments allow this? Well, because it raised a lot of money, which then could be produced into taxes. Okay. A lot of people escaped. Right? And you think, why didn't sometimes kids will ask, well, why didn't people run away? They did. You know, even before the transatlantic slave trade itself is established, like the first enslaved Africans in the Americas were people who'd been enslaved in Spain, and they were on the island right in the middle of the Caribbean, Hispaniola, where the Dominican Republic is. And even before the first ship with enslaved people came from Africa to the Americas, there were already black people who'd gotten free and were living up in the mountains with Indian people away from slavery. And in Brazil, those people wouldn't go up in the mountains because there wasn't so much mountainous, but they would go further into the interior away from the coast. But the Portuguese expanded their control as part of trying to bring these enslaved people back in. So there's a struggle over freedom, like from the very beginning. And some people get free and some people don't. One other thing to say here is that the colonial economy, as we have it, then is going to be based on exports. And so that means these places were set up to produce like a limited number of things that would be exported somewhere else. And then they would import anything else they needed. So they weren't self sufficient. Okay. And so there's other things that are going to be exported. These are all natural products that would be exported here. Cacao is like the raw ingredient for chocolate. So some of these things are Columbian exchange, like coffee and wheat that had come from the other hemisphere, or beef hides. Others, like cacao and tobacco, were products that Europeans found in the New World and then started to produce for profit. This will be the last slide here. We'll do. So when you look at the colonial government in the Spanish system, they called their colonies viceroyalties, like the royal, like in place of the king. So again, you can look at this map and you can see the current day countries. This goes from what's today the southwestern United States and California, all the way down to Argentina and Chile at the bottom of South America, way down here. But each of these areas then had a person who came from Spain. There was a viceroy who'd be like a governor, and an archbishop in charge of the Catholic Church, and then a high court that was like the Supreme Court, if you will, that would hear cases. So part of colonization is that Spanish colonizers established their own government like on top of this land. That's part of taking it over, and installed their own officials. One last slide. I know I said that was the last one, but so I wanted to make this point here. This government then raised a lot of revenue. 1/5 of all the silver that came across the Atlantic Ocean from the mines in the Andes Mountains and in Mexico, 1/5, or the quinto, went to the king. And then the Spanish kings they just blew all this money on pointless religious wars in Europe. It's really a shame. Um, but so that happened. There's a Spanish coin there. Also, people were taxed. Indios, which was a Spanish term for indigenous people, were taxed directly. So either per person or per community, they had to pay taxes. One thing to note with this, so that doesn't seem fair, and it's not, and it's a kind of colonialism. They colonized the area. But it's also different than how the English behaved when they took areas over, like in what became the United States, because the Spanish saw themselves also as protecting Indian communities, which, I mean, it's twisted and wrong, but they did view those communities as having a right to continue to exist. So it's the Spanish were not as exterminationist as the English in their colonialism. And But like the English, the Spanish and Portuguese colonists wanted to extract revenue from the colonies um, in order to make it worthwhile. So colonial Latin America then refers to Spanish and Portuguese, especially colonies in the Americas, created a mix of European, African, and Native American cultures. And the colonial period extends until these places became independent in the 1820s. So countries like Mexico and Colombia and Peru, Brazil, they all became independent in the 1820s. So in the coming decade, there's going to be a lot of bicentennial celebrations in Spanish and Portuguese speaking America. All right. Well, thank you for listening all the way through, and I look forward to talking about this more with you.